Hello and welcome to my channel. I haven't done any work in graphite in a while, so this one is going to be in graphite, and I actually plan to do this same scene in colored pencil, or a similar scene in colored pencil, in a few days. But now let's have a look at this one. This one is going to be slightly smaller. I'm working on an A5 size Fabriano sketching paper, and I'm going to use Koh-i-Noor graphite pencils. These are conventional graphite pencils, unlike some of the matte graphite pencils which I used in some of my previous videos. So these are just regular graphite pencils. The first thing I'm going to do is sketch out the shape of the mountains in the distance, and then I'm going to take it from there. I don't really need to sketch out the whole scene. I'm going to shade the sky lightly with a little bit of value, just a little bit of HB. I have a number of different pencils here, a number of different grades. I don't know if I'll use all of them, but the darkest one that I have is an 8B. I'm going to use that for some of the darker elements in the foreground. So like I said, I'm going to shade the background, or I'm going to shade the sky lightly, and then try to create a little bit of variation there, something like an overcast, cloudy sky. I'm going to blend all of this with a piece of paper tissue, which is great for blending larger, lighter areas. It blends very smoothly, and as you can see, the amount of value that I laid down is barely there. I'm just going to use a kneaded eraser, or a kneadable eraser, to lift up a little bit of graphite here and there and make some of these clouds a little bit lighter, like maybe a little bit of the light is breaking through or illuminating some of the parts of those clouds. The important thing about the kneaded eraser is that you keep kneading it, you keep reshaping it so that it's actually able to lift up any material. The graphite pencils that I'm using for this one, the Koh-i-Noor graphite pencils, are the graphite pencils which I used initially when I started my drawing career. And back then I worked almost exclusively in graphite, and I mostly did portraits. Nowadays I use all kinds of media, but I also do a lot more of these landscapes than portraits. Even though I still do portraits, I do a lot of commission portraits. Anyway, I'm going to shade this mountain peak, or a group of mountains in the back, but I don't want to make it too dark. I'm going to start a little bit lighter, using that same HB, but this time laying down a little bit more material and putting down a little bit more pressure, and maybe throw in a little bit of 2B as well, because I want a bit of variation in value. Now, for blending, I like to use a variety of tools. Initially I used paper tissue for the sky. Here I'm using a tortillon a little bit for some of the smaller details. I want to establish a clean edge between that mountain ridge and the background. To blend the rest of it more smoothly, I'm using a Q-tip. A Q-tip is a great blending tool with graphite because it allows for very smooth transitions, very smooth gradients and value, and it can blend graphite more smoothly than pretty much any other tool. As you can see, I'm leaving some areas of lighter value around the bottom of this mountain. So let's say a few words about the general idea. I'm not going to have a reference photo this time. I kind of examined a number of similar photos and paintings, but my idea was to draw a misty or a foggy scene with mountains and trees enveloped in fog. so that only the peaks of the mountains and the tops of some of the canopies are kind of sticking out of that mist. So that was my idea, and now I'm adding some details to these mountains in the back, just making some parts of those crests a little bit darker. I don't want to have too much. I don't want to have too much detail or too much texture in that area, because those objects are much further away, so they can't be too detailed. I always, when I'm drawing these landscapes, I always try to imitate the atmospheric effect, meaning that I try to simplify the objects in the distance, reduce the amount of contrast, value, and texture, so that they further amplify that feeling of distance. Anyway, I'm starting to throw in some smaller details, like some trees. We're going to have a bunch of slopes here, and they're going to be covered with groups or rows of trees. And I'm drawing them in such a manner so that I'm mostly drawing the top part of the canopy and maybe a little bit of the middle, and I'm kind of fading the rest of it into that white area or lighter area where the mist is supposed to be. So I always want it to look like the trees are disappearing into the mist. Some of them are going to appear a little bit darker, and others, which are a little bit further away or deeper in that fog, are going to appear lighter and barely visible. It's also important for me to blend them a little bit with a tortillon, and I can even use a tortillon as a drawing tool. I can use it to draw some of the lighter shapes of those trees which are barely visible in the fog. Anyway, I'm now shading this slope here to the left. So like I said, I want to have multiple overlapping slopes, and that way I can stack elements one in front of the other and create that feeling of depth. So I'm shading this with a little bit more value than some of the objects behind it. I'm using a little bit more of the 2B, but it's going to get even darker once I actually blend it, because initially when you shade like this, there are a lot of these lighter spaces in between the pencil marks, but once you actually start blending, you start covering those lighter spaces, and in that way you actually increase the overall amount of value. But the slope is going to get even darker once I put some more shadows and details and trees on it. Now I'm going to start adding some trees at the top of that slope. I'm going to vary their shapes and their sizes ever so slightly. I want to make it look like some of these trees are a little bit larger than the others. Some of them are maybe really tall, others are kind of small, like young trees. So in addition to creating some variation in size because of the distance, I'm also going to create some additional variation in size and shape, because trees obviously are all different from one another. And I'm just adding some more of those conical tapering shapes, which are supposed to represent coniferous trees, something like fir trees. And I'm going to have a whole bunch of those here. Here I'm adding another group of trees. Well, let me say a few words about how you can approach drawing landscapes. Sometimes you can start from larger relationships, larger contrasts between areas of lighter and darker value. You can sort of sketch out and block in the whole thing. Sometimes you can start from details. It's difficult to say which approach is better. I like to use a combination of the two, because sometimes I just do a little bit of blocking in and establishing those larger contrasts in one part of the scene, and then when I move on to another segment, I maybe choose a slightly different approach. So here When I worked on the sky and that mountain in the back, I first established some of the larger values, larger contrasts, and then I added the details later. But then when I moved on to these slopes, I first added a row of trees in the fog. That was because I wanted to sort of give myself an idea about how much value I'm going to need with trees. Some of them are going to be lighter, others a little bit darker, and also what the size is going to be and what the shape of the slopes will be, and how they will be positioned. So sometimes adding or throwing in a few details can help you move things along and kind of explain things to yourself a little bit better, where it's easier for you to kind of develop your composition and develop your vision, how the landscape is supposed to look. So I like to use a combination of these two approaches. In addition to that, I also like to use a combination of different types of tools. Here I'm working exclusively with graphite pencils, but I've often combined graphite pencils with some other drawing tools. On the other hand, the blending tools, I'm using a variety of blending tools. I used a paper towel, a Q-tip, a Tortillion, and I'm using a couple of different brushes. I don't like to limit myself to just one type of a blending tool or even one type of an erasing tool, because they all behave slightly differently, they all have slightly different effects, and I want to use the advantages of each and every one of them. And that is why I like to use different tools, different blending tools as well as different erasing tools. Now, for those of you who don't really have much experience with these materials, you probably are not really sure what I'm talking about, because there's only so much you can explain to people in the videos, because a lot of these tools you have to try them, you have to take them into your hand and try to work with them to see how they feel and what they can do, because not everything can be explained. Something has to be felt and discovered through practice. Anyways, you can see I've already done more than a half of this scene, and now I'm shading this large slope in the foreground. That will be my foreground area, and the foreground area is going to be a little bit darker overall. So you can see that I added even more value on this slope in comparison to the ones in the back. You can also see that I deliberately left some parts of the scene kind of foggy and lighter in value. I'm going to refine those a little bit later. There's no need to try to work on those misty effects just yet. First, I want to draw a bunch of trees and finish pretty much 98% of the scene, and then I will tackle the fog a little bit later. That's where I will use erasers, but for now I work with pencils. This is the 8B now. I am switching to my darkest pencils here because the elements in the foreground are going to be really dark. I want to create a lot of contrast and tension between the foreground and the background, and what I want to do is create a feeling of depth in this scene, and in order to achieve that, one of the ways is to control the amount of value so that you are imitating that atmospheric effect that I talked about, where everything sort of fades into the distance and where the stuff in the foreground is always a little bit darker, or there's more contrast or more texture. And here I'm allowing my pencil to create that texture, to create that illusion of detail. So it's not just that I'm making deliberate pencil marks to imitate the appearance of a fir tree, where you can see how I draw a tall tapering shape, and then I draw the branches that grow out to the side. But I also allow the pencil to create some of the texture of its own, and when you blend, a lot of that texture still remains. And now with a lighter pencil, or rather with a harder pencil, I'm drawing some lighter shapes in the fog. These are further away and hidden in the fog, and that's why I'm using less value on them. I'm using harder pencil grades, and that's one of the advantages of graphite, because with charcoal it can be a little bit difficult to achieve these details of lighter value. You can either try to use blending tools such as Tortillions to draw with them, or you can try to use brushes, or you can try to draw something with a piece of vine charcoal or a charcoal pencil and then remove the value later. Vine charcoal makes things a little bit easier when it comes to drawing these lighter shapes and lighter details, because the amount of value can be manipulated so easily. But with graphite pencils you don't really have the need to worry about any of these things. If you want to make something lighter, you just pick up a harder pencil. If you want to make something darker, you pick up a softer pencil, and that way you know the pencil you have is going to produce a certain amount of value. Because with harder pencils, even if you try to use more of the material or try to press a little bit harder, you will still find that there are limitations to each and every one of those pencils, and there's only so much value they can produce. And once you reach that limit, you have to switch to a darker pencil. So that's one of the things that on one hand feel maybe a little bit more complicated about graphite pencils, because you have to use multiple pencils. But on the other hand, it's also an advantage, because you know that by using multiple pencils it's easier for you to create a greater range of value and to create a more realistic looking landscape that has a feeling of depth and distance. Anyway, now I'm going to draw some more darker trees. I'm going to slap another tall tree here in front of this lighter group in the middle, or rather to the right. And I'm going to draw or throw in another tall one, a very large one here all the way on the right. So these are all foreground objects, and because they are foreground objects, they're going to be better defined, both in terms of their shape and detail, but they're also going to have more value and contrast, because once again I'm trying to create contrast and tension between the elements in the foreground and the background. This tree on the right had a little bit too much texture, so I worked on it a little bit with a brush, but I'm going to have to go over it a few more times just to simplify it a little bit in terms of detail. I don't want it to be exactly like a silhouette. Maybe there can be a little bit of variation, but I want it a bit simpler, obviously, because there's too many of those lines still showing through. Now I drew like a group of lighter trees, or maybe some bushes, whatever they are, in the back, and then I'm going to draw some darker trees in front of those. I'm going to make these a little bit smaller, like these are maybe shorter, younger trees scattered on that slope, and then a few more trees here and there, again varying in size and shape. And I'm going to draw another larger tree here on the left. So one of the things that you will often see when you're kind of building up a landscape like this is that often you will cover some parts of the background which you previously did. But you know, that's not a big deal. You can't really know exactly where everything's going to be and how exactly the landscape will turn out. So I will often just slap new elements on top of the other ones to create that feeling of distance. Here I'm just using a Tortillion to draw some faint shapes of the tops of those canopies of trees, kind of popping out of that mist. So these are just suggestions of those small shapes in the mist. And now I'm just doing a little bit more work with a brush, softening some of those lines and textures in the foreground and making some parts of it a little bit darker. And now I'm going to do a little bit of refining on this mist, and First I did a bit of work with a Tombow Mono Zero eraser, and now I'm using the kneaded eraser. I usually use either Koh-i-Noor or Faber-Castell kneaded erasers, and they work pretty good. But the thing is that you have to keep reshaping them, you have to keep remolding them so that they can continue to lift up the material. But the thing is that sometimes when you don't want to lift up too much of the material, you can just dab on the area continuously, and that way your kneaded eraser is picking up a little bit of the material and putting a bit of it back in, and that way you're creating some soft cloudy or smoky effects. You can do that when you're drawing clouds, when you want the clouds to look kind of semi-transparent or softer or more wispy, or you can do that with some foggy or misty effects. But when you want to create cleaner lines, lighter cleaner lines with a kneaded eraser, you can also drag the kneaded eraser, and you can then reshape it and then clean up and drag again. That way you create cleaner marks. So basically you can dab or drag your kneaded eraser depending on what you want to achieve. I added some more trees here to make it look like a group of trees and to make this tree look a little bit smaller. And now I'm just dabbing a little bit to soften some of those misty effects and to make that fog, that mist, a little bit more transparent in certain areas. So like I said, when you're dabbing like this, you're not creating very clean marks, you're not erasing very clean marks, you're rather creating soft marks because the kneaded eraser is getting dirty, it's lifting up a little bit of graphite and it's putting it back in, creating a softer transition between the areas of lighter and darker value. So I'm just going to keep dabbing a little bit until I refine this lighter part of my landscape, especially at the bottom of those trees where they kind of disappear into the mist. Anyway, I'm pretty much done with this scene. I'm just going to put my signature here on the right side, and I'm going to draw that signature with a Tombow Mono Zero eraser as best as I can, and that'll do it, I think. So this is what the finished drawing looks like. Let me know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe and give me a like, and check out my other videos. Now, if you want to see longer full-length videos and more content, you should check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.